In the Second World War, the Nazis built not only bunkers and headquarters. In the mountains of Lower Silesia, they begin carving into the rock not a single facility, but an entire network of underground complexes. 7 separate nodes, tunnels beneath the Owl Mountains, works in the area of Ksiaz Castle, and almost no clear answer to the main question. What exactly were they trying to hide underground in the last months of the Reich? Today, what remains of Project Riese are unfinished corridors, concrete vaults, traces of blasting works, and a camp network tied to the Gross-Rosen system. Too few official documents survive to close the case with a single file. But enough remains to understand one thing. This was not an ordinary construction project, but one of the darkest and most secret undertakings of the late Third Reich. And at the center of this story stands a figure through whom concrete, forced labor, urgency, secrecy, and disappearance in May 1945 all converge. His name is Hans Kammler, a man whose name is rarely spoken as loudly as the names of the most famous Nazi leaders, yet without whom the story of Riese remains incomplete. To understand why they carved this underground world into the mountains, we first need to understand why the very idea of such a project became possible at all. Up to a certain point, there was an almost iron rule in the logic of the Third Reich. Critically important facilities could be fortified, camouflaged, dispersed, protected by guards and anti-aircraft guns. But building an entire hidden underground city inside the mountains was considered too expensive, too slow, and too difficult even for wartime Germany. That was the view not only of staff officers. Engineers, armaments officials, transport and supply specialists thought the same way. A project like this required enormous quantities of concrete, steel, timber, explosives, machinery, labor, and railway deliveries. The mountain massif itself dictated its own pace. Stone could not be forced to obey a single order. As long as Germany is advancing, such an idea seems almost pointless. The Reich expands its control over territory, relocates production, strengthens key zones, builds bunkers and standard protected facilities. In such a system, the mountain remains an obstacle, not a refuge. It is something to bypass, pierce through, use as terrain, but not transform into a new hidden center of the war machine. Even when pressure from Allied aviation begins to intensify, Berlin still believes the threat can be contained by familiar means. Additional camouflage, dispersal of workshops, relocation of selected production sites, reinforcement of air defenses. All of this is difficult but understandable. Far more understandable than the idea of building an entire underground network deep inside mountain rock. But the war gradually changes the very scale of what is considered possible. The bombings become systematic. The surface stops being reliable. Factories burn, communications hubs are destroyed, railway routes come under constant threat. What had recently been the rear now lives under the shadow of air strikes. The sky is no longer a space of maneuver. It becomes the enemy's weapon. It is at this moment that a new logic is born. If the most important functions can no longer be protected on the surface, they must be taken underground. Not into isolated shelters and not into ordinary bunkers, but deeper, farther, and on a far greater scale, into a place where the rock itself becomes armor. This is no longer simply an engineering fantasy. It is the response of a regime that feels the familiar architecture of war beginning to collapse. Lower Silesia seems especially important within that logic. Mountain massifs, transport lines, a developed industrial environment, and relative distance from an immediate frontline breakdown make the region suitable for facilities of a special category. On the map, it may look like a rational choice, but another meaning is already audible behind it. The Reich begins to build not out of confidence, but out of fear of losing control. By this point, the price of any major decision has become enormous. Materials are scarce. Transport is overloaded. Time is running out, yet this is exactly when the demands become harsher. The leadership of the Reich is looking for a way to preserve, beneath the protection of the mountains, whatever can still prolong resistance. Command, special production, perhaps communications or other critical functions that can no longer be left exposed beneath the sky. That is how the old rule breaks. What only recently had seemed excessive even for a regime of giant ambitions now becomes an urgent task. It is no longer enough to build new bunkers. The concept of another scale emerges. Not a single shelter, but a system. Not a temporary measure, but an underground space meant to outlast whatever on the surface is becoming more and more vulnerable. It is precisely then, in the mountains of Lower Silesia, that a project appears under the code name Riese, Giant. The name alone speaks of scale. This is not a local military point and not a standard reserve facility. Something larger, more expensive, and more ominous begins to be prepared inside the rock. Something meant either to shelter vital functions of the regime or to preserve them after the familiar world above has been shattered. But with the scale comes mystery. The more resources are poured into the future complex, the less clarity there is about its final purpose. A new headquarters, an underground command center, a production hub, a facility of mixed function. From the very start, one thing is clear. Germany is entering a phase of the war in which the very idea of an underground city ceases to be madness and becomes part of military calculation. From that moment on, the story of Project Riese ceases to be merely a story of construction. It becomes a story of fear, urgency, and hidden design. What stands before us is not the symbol of a confident regime building a new future. It is the first sign that the Third Reich has begun searching for a depth in which it can hide whatever is becoming harder and harder to protect on the surface. At the center of this story stands a man whose name long remained in the shadow of the more famous figures of the Third Reich. Yet some of the darkest lines of the late war converge through him. His name is Hans Kammler. An engineer by education and an SS general by position, he belongs to that class of men who turn the ideology of the regime into concrete calculations, schedules, and coercion. By the time Project Riese reaches a level of special secrecy, Kammler is in his early 40s. For someone of that age, he has already gone too far inside a system where advancement is determined not only by ambition, but by willingness to carry out tasks requiring cold efficiency and complete moral indifference. He is not one of the public faces of the regime. His environment is that of closed offices, construction administrations, special programs, and urgent orders. His strength lies neither in personal charisma nor in propaganda. Kammler operates where war demands not speeches, but the organization of large processes. He thinks like an engineer and acts like an administrator of emergency rule. Where others see an insoluble task, he looks for a way to force the system forward at any cost. If time is lacking, the schedules are tightened. If there are not enough workers, they are taken from the camps. If clarity is lacking, the project is fragmented and hidden behind a new level of secrecy. That is precisely what makes Kammler so well suited to the late Reich. Germany no longer lives in the mode of confident expansion. It lives in a mode of crisis, where it needs men capable of linking construction, armaments, transport, security, and the camp system into a single, manageable mechanism. Kammler belongs exactly to that category. He's not merely an administrator. He is an instrument of the regime, shaped for projects where scale and cruelty move side by side. That is why his name appears next to some of the largest and most tightly concealed programs of the final war years. He is needed where a facility must be built quickly, secretly, and under conditions of general exhaustion, where the official purpose does not have to be revealed to every participant, where success depends not only on engineering, but on a willingness to turn human beings into expendable material without hesitation. For Project Riese, such a figure was almost inevitable. The scale is too great. There are too many separate work zones, too many services, contractors, camp detachments, guards, and suppliers have to act simultaneously. A project of this kind cannot be sustained by construction logic alone. It requires a center of will capable of accelerating, concealing, reallocating resources, and asking no unnecessary questions about the cost. That is why Kammler becomes the central figure of the investigation. When we try to understand why such a large underground network began to be carved into the mountains of Lower Silesia, we inevitably arrive at the man through whom decisions about priorities, labor, pace, and the nature of secrecy passed. Kammler is not an observer. He is the one who moves the project from the realm of concept into the realm of forced execution. By this point, he has already acquired a reputation for extraordinary efficiency. Not human efficiency, but administrative and mechanical efficiency. He knows how to launch large processes, bind together different structures, and keep them moving even in a system already cracking under the pressure of war. In the late Reich, that kind of efficiency becomes a special form of power because it allows impossible projects to continue longer than they should be able to exist, and now a task of a very special category stands before him. It is not a secondary facility and not an ordinary reserve center that must be moved underground. Underground, a complex must be created on such a scale that it can either shelter the most important elements of power and command or preserve critical military functions at the moment when the surface becomes too dangerous. This is no longer just construction. It is an attempt to create a depth space for the survival of the regime. The task is nearly beyond limits. It must be done quickly, although underground construction is slow by its very nature. Secrecy must be maintained, although thousands of people are involved. The network of sites must be expanded even as resources become scarcer. Forced labor must be used without regard for human loss, because that is what makes it possible to sustain the pace. In such a system, Kammler does not look like an accidental man. He looks like its natural instrument. From that moment on, Project Riese ceases to be simply a point on the map. It becomes a test of the entire system assembled around Kammler. The SS, camp administration, engineering services, builders, suppliers, transport, security. All these elements must work in sync if a new kind of underground space is to emerge in the mountains. Without a center such as Kammler, this whole network would quickly have collapsed under the weight of its own complexity. But hidden within Kammler's figure is the darkest feature of the entire story. The clearer his role becomes, the more obvious it is that Project Riese could not have been an ordinary emergency construction project. It required a special level of control, a special level of secrecy, and a special level of brutality. That means that from the outset, the project belonged to that category of undertakings in which the goal was considered so important that the human price ceased to matter. At the same time, Kammler remains a man of shadow. He leaves behind no loud political legend. He does not become a symbol of party rallies and does not live within the aura of propagandistic theater. And that is precisely what makes him especially sinister. He acts not in the glare of lights, but in a chain of orders where decisions move downward and turn into tunnels, concrete, barbed wire, and disappearing traces. The deeper we look into his place in this story, the clearer it becomes why he stood at the center of Project Riese. The Reich did not need an ideologue or an orator. It needed a man capable of building an underground world in the midst of collapse, and of doing so with the inhuman consistency without which such a project could not have lasted even a few months. From this point on, the mystery of Riese has a face, and that face is Hans Kammler. Preparation for Project Riese begins the way the most dangerous projects of the late Reich had to begin. Not with loud announcements, but with growing silence. Engineers, surveyors, guards, and construction groups appear in the mountains of Lower Silesia. On the map, this still does not look like the center of one of the largest secret programs. But on the ground, the scale of the works and the unusual level of closure can already be felt. At first, what is happening can be mistaken for yet another wartime construction site. By then, Germany is building bunkers, fortifications, underground workshops, and reserve facilities. But very quickly it becomes clear that something different is unfolding here. Work is taking place at several points at once. The future complexes do not form one single site. They are scattered like parts of a system that even many of its own executors are not meant to see as a whole. That fragmentation becomes the first important detail of the investigation. In the Owl Mountains and in the area of Ksiaz Castle, separate nodes of the underground complex begin to take shape. This is no longer one tunnel and no longer one shelter. It is a network. Several sites, each with its own configuration, its own entrances, its own volumes, and very likely its own intended function within the overall design. Such scale requires more than drilling and concrete. It requires management hidden from outside observation, transport, supply, security, labor allocation, engineering calculations, timber deliveries for supports, metal for reinforcement, and fuel for machinery all have to be coordinated. And all of it must be done without letting outsiders understand what exactly is being created deep in the mountains. Secrecy becomes as much a building material as rock, steel, and concrete. At this stage, Project Riese still does not reveal its final purpose. That is exactly what gives it such force as a historical mystery. Some elements point toward the possibility of a large protected command center. Others look more like groundwork for underground capacities that could function beyond the reach of aviation. But already during preparation, one thing is clear. The project is conceived not as a temporary shelter, but as a system of significant depth and complexity. The area of Ksiaz Castle takes on special importance. Above ground, it is an old residence, one of the most striking in the region. But beneath it and beside it, works unfold that change the very meaning of the place. Underground spaces are being driven there, and it is here that the question which will haunt the entire story of Riese becomes especially sharp. For whom or for what were these hidden levels and protected approaches being prepared? The further the works advance, the more visible the signs of haste. Construction does not develop in the rhythm of a calm, long-term project. It presses on everyone with deadlines that seem almost impossible. Drilling and expanding the excavations require blasting, clearing, hauling out rock, reinforcing walls, opening passages, organizing ventilation, and constant safety control. Every further meter demands more time, strength, and resources than it appears to require on paper. Soon a special infrastructure begins to form around the construction, without which such a project could not exist. And this is the point at which the engineering story finally ceases to be merely an engineering story. Because alongside contractors, guards, and supply lines, the camp system enters the mountain region. Project Riese is drawn into the orbit of Gross-Rosen, and that means the pace of construction is now being paid for not only in materials, but in human lives. The sub-camps linked to the complex become part of the mechanism hidden inside the official secrecy. Prisoners are used for the heaviest labor. They haul materials, clear passages, carry out rock, and work in a cold, damp, dust-filled environment where every meter of progress is bought at the price of exhaustion. The construction grows, not because the Reich has suddenly found new possibilities, but because it throws people into the mountains as expendable resource. It is here that it becomes clear that Riese is not simply a facility, but a system. The SS provides control and secrecy. Camp administration supplies forced labor. Engineers determine how to move through difficult rock and where the vaults must be reinforced. Contractors handle concrete, timber, tools, and transport. Security seals this world from the outside so that only those ordered to work or to command may enter it. But even with such mobilization, the project confronts a harsh reality. A mountain massif cannot be forced to obey political will. The rock demands time, support structures, and the correct geometry of excavation. Water, humidity, cave-ins, bottlenecks, poor air and the constant need to reinforce already open sections make every next stage more expensive than the last. The mountain resists. And that resistance cannot be abolished by either command or fear. At the same time, the war outside continues to intensify the pressure. The Reich no longer possesses the former abundance of materials and transport. Railways are overloaded. Deliveries fail. Fuel is distributed under strain. Any large underground project begins to fight not only the stone, but also the unraveling wartime economy itself. That means Riese is being built at the very moment when Germany is becoming less and less capable of sustaining such scale without severe cost. And yet the construction is not halted. On the contrary, it is driven forward with increasing harshness. This is one of the most disturbing signs in the whole story. A project that under other conditions would have required a long cycle of planning and execution is now being forced through a narrowing window of time that is almost gone. Secondary facilities are not built like this. This is how only what is considered vital is built. But vital for what exactly? That is the question that begins to sound louder and louder. If production is meant to be moved underground, then special capacities, communications, power, storage, and technical logic are needed. If it is a headquarters or a command node, then protected rooms, communication systems, transport approaches, and separate sectors are required. The preparation for Riese leaves traces of both possibilities and therefore only deepens the mystery. In some sections, one can see an attempt to create spaces of significant volume, as though intended not for a short period, but for prolonged use. In others, there is a sense of incompleteness and abrupt decision-making, as though the project were constantly changing on the move. This is an important detail. The preparation does not look like the straightforward execution of one fully defined plan. It looks more like a system that grows, restructures itself, and simultaneously conceals its own final form. That is how the key tension of the first part of Act 3 emerges. The more forces are drawn into Riese, the less transparent its purpose becomes. New excavations appear underground. The camp network expands on the surface. Security is tightened. Engineering activity increases. Yet the logical picture does not become clearer. Here, secrecy works not as a shell around an already completed design, but as part of the design itself. And in this lies Kammler's particular role at the stage of preparation. He is needed not only as coordinator, but as the man capable of holding together the scattered elements of an enormous system. Without such a center, this network of sites, camps, contractors, and restricted zones would quickly have collapsed under the weight of its own complexity. Kammler turns the chaos of the late Reich into a directed movement downward, into the thickness of the mountains. If this plan fails, Germany will lose not merely another hidden facility. It will lose the chance to hide underground what can no longer be reliably protected above ground. That is why the first stage of Project Riese is filled with such anxiety. What stands before us is not ordinary preparation for a secret construction site. It is the convulsive beginning of a project that must be completed before the war itself reaches it. The further Project Riese advances, the more visible a strange pattern becomes. Normally, the larger a construction project grows, the more clearly it begins to explain its own purpose. Here, the opposite happens. Tunnels go deeper, chambers expand, concrete is poured into the rock, and the overall meaning of the complex becomes only more obscure. It is precisely here that the first real crisis of the project begins. In some sections, everything looks as though protected spaces for command are being prepared underground. Wide halls, branching passages, hints of an internal organization that might support staff work. The area of Ksiaz raises especially strong questions, where the residents above ground and the excavations below seem to be forming a single disturbing structure. But even that does not provide full clarity. In other zones, the picture is different. There, the logic feels more technical or industrial. Passages that might lead to production sectors, spaces that resemble groundwork for machinery, and an overall rhythm of work more suggestive of protected operating infrastructure than the creation of one isolated headquarters. These traces do not easily collapse into one simple explanation. That is why Riese begins to resist any direct interpretation. If this is only a headquarters, why the scattered layout of the sites and such uneven preparation? If it is one underground factory, why do some elements look more like a hidden administrative system? The project seems to be developing in several directions at once and offers no answer that can be accepted without reservations. For those directing the construction, such uncertainty is no less dangerous than a shortage of concrete or transport. The more complex the project, the more strongly it depends on internal logic. And in the case of Riese, that logic seems constantly to slip away. The work continues, the volumes grow. More and more people are thrown into the mountains, yet the structure remains unfinished, not only physically, but conceptually. That is already a sign of a looming breakdown. The crisis intensifies because the project develops faster than it can finally take shape. In normal engineering practice, a relatively clear scheme is established first, and only then does implementation proceed. Here, the war reverses that sequence. First comes the forced drive deeper into the rock, the expansion of work zones, and the growth of camp infrastructure, and only then does it become clearer and clearer that the final model of the complex remains blurred. On the surface, this problem is barely visible. Guards stand their posts, supplies move, drilling continues, new sections are brought into operation. But inside the system, tension is growing. Every new excavation demands a decision about what exactly it is being created for. Every supply line requires a priority. Every reinforced concrete support implies that someone already knows the final shape of the facility. And that very knowledge seems, again and again, to remain incomplete. The late Reich lives in a mode in which many decisions are made under the pressure of weeks rather than months. That is especially visible in Riese. The project is already too large to change direction easily, yet still too unfinished to state its purpose with confidence. It hangs between a possible headquarters, a possible industrial center, and a reserve underground system, and in that intermediate state, it begins to consume strength at a frightening rate. At the same time, the external situation changes. By the end of 1944, it becomes harder and harder for Germany to sustain such construction at the old pace. Air war is exhausting industry. Transport works with interruptions. Materials become ever more precious. Any major underground site turns into a luxury for which the regime can scarcely still afford the time. Yet precisely then, Riese continues to be driven forward. This is the moment when the crisis ceases to be hidden. The project is already too heavy to be completed easily and too important to be simply stopped. It resembles a giant machine launched inside a mountain massif, but deprived of stable balance. Each new week increases the investment, yet guarantees no result. Every ton of concrete strengthens the tunnels, but does not remove the main question: what exactly all of this is being driven toward? To that internal uncertainty is added the most dangerous factor of war: time. At the start of projects like this, there is always an illusion of reserve. It seems there is still time to gain a few more months, to go deeper, expand further, reinforce more, and conceal more. But by the end of 1944, that reserve begins to disappear. Front lines move, and with them disappears the room for long engineering designs. The mountain remains where it is, but the war is already near. The Soviet advance is approaching, and that changes everything. Now, Project Riese must not merely be built quickly. It must be completed before the very meaning of the construction is destroyed by the advance of the front. The underground complex was conceived as an answer to the threat from the air, and now it comes under the threat of territorial capture from the ground. That makes every delay dangerous not just for one section, but for the entire project. In the camps and sub-camps connected to Riese, exhaustion accumulates. People are working under the harshest conditions, and it is on their bodies that the pace rests. A pace that otherwise would have collapsed long before. But even that monstrous resource is not endless. The system feeding the construction with forced labor begins itself to suffocate. Exhaustion, disease, shortages of supplies, and the nervousness of the end of the war eat away at the foundation of the whole complex. Now the crisis of Project Riese appears at two levels at once. From an engineering point of view, the facility remains unclear and unfinished. From a military point of view, it is beginning to lose against time. This is especially important. The project is endangered, not because the Allies have already uncovered all its secrets and launched a precise strike. It is failing from within because its design was larger than Germany's capabilities in the final months of the war. The closer the front comes, the less the project resembles a confident construction site, and the more it looks like a frantic attempt to catch up with its own promise. The work continues, but now it sounds less like strength than like anxiety. Builders, guards, administrators, the camp system, engineering groups, and the SS apparatus move forward not because they clearly see the finish, but because stopping would amount to admitting that the giant has proven too much even for the Reich itself. It is here that one of the darkest questions of the entire story emerges. What is more frightening for the late Nazi regime, losing the underground facility itself or admitting that even it can no longer save the situation? If Riese was conceived as a shelter for power, there's not enough time left to make it fully ready. If, as an underground production base, it does not have time to become a complete organism, both possible functions strike the same obstacle. Defeat begins to seem almost inevitable, but not in the familiar sense in which one army simply defeats another in battle. Here the enemy becomes the very disproportion between the design and the historical moment. Project Riese is too large for the dying wartime economy, too complex for compressed time, and launched too late to be completed before the map of Europe changes for good. By the beginning of 1945, the central illusion of Riese begins to fall apart. One can go deeper into the mountains. One can conceal certain functions behind the thickness of rock. One can destroy traces and strengthen security, but one cannot postpone confrontation with the reality of war forever. The front is approaching, resources are disappearing, people are exhausted, and the underground complex is still not ready to become what it may have been started to become. It is precisely at this moment that the nature of Project Riese changes sharply. Just recently, it was a secret construction site that could still be described in the language of engineering, supply, and deadlines. Now it becomes a frantic attempt to save underground what can no longer be held on the surface. The project is no longer being built for some distant future. It is being built against the end that is drawing near. The turning point does not come because of a single document or a single day. It is made up of an entire chain of signs. The haste intensifies. Secrecy grows harsher. Every work that could once have belonged to a long-term plan is now subordinated to a different rhythm. It is no longer enough simply to continue building. It becomes urgent to decide what must be pushed toward priority readiness and what may have to remain unfinished. It is here that Hans Kammler moves fully to the foreground, no longer merely as a coordinator, but as the man of last choices. When no time remains, any project requires a hard hierarchy. What to reinforce, what to expand, what to conceal, what to shift into the regime of extreme urgency. At such a moment, the system inevitably contracts around the one who can make decisions without hesitation and without regard for the cost. For Kammler, this is the true hour of Project Riese. Until then, it could be regarded as one of the major secret sites of the Reich. Now it becomes an underground wager of desperation, even if its ultimate function still cannot be proven in every detail. What matters now is not only what Riese was originally intended to become. What matters is that, by the end of the war, The remaining hopes of preserving command, production, or some hidden support of the regime begin to be drawn into it. Outside, the war continues pressing from every side. Allied aviation retains destructive superiority. Any major facility on the surface remains vulnerable. Any open site is under threat. In these conditions, the very logic of underground construction begins to seem almost the only possible one. Not because it is ideal, but because every other method of protection has already shown its limits. But at the same time, another force is approaching that makes the completion of Riese almost impossible. The advance of the Red Army turns time from a shortage into the chief enemy of the entire construction. The underground complex was meant to become a refuge from strikes from above, and now it faces the threat of the territory itself being overrun. The mountains still shield the concrete and the tunnels, but they can no longer stop the movement of the front. It is precisely this double pressure that turns the project into something intermediate between a headquarters, a factory, and a facility of last resort. It matters less now which of those functions was originally primary. What matters far more is that, by the end of the war, Riese begins to absorb the remnants of hope. Beneath the ground, they try to move not only equipment and administration, but the very possibility of continuing resistance in hidden form. That is why some sections likely receive special priority. Not necessarily because they were the most important from the very beginning, but because under conditions of extreme time pressure, they seem the most valuable to finish first. This is the typical logic of a project in crisis. When the full design can no longer be realized, the system contracts into a core, and then it becomes especially important to understand what the leadership considered that core to be. Thus, Project Riese finally ceases to be only a construction mystery. It becomes a reflection of the last months of the Third Reich. The regime no longer thinks in terms of stable victory. It thinks in terms of shelter, delay, preservation of remaining power, and production capacity. The underground complex becomes a materialized form of that shift in which fear and calculation are fused into one system. At the level of daily work, this looks like intensifying brutality. The pace cannot be reduced, although exhaustion is already obvious. Prisoners continue to be used under conditions in which the human body has long since exhausted its limits. Labor burns up as quickly as materials and time disappear. But that is exactly why the pressure from above grows even stronger. The closer collapse comes, the more mercilessly the system demands the impossible. And in this lies one of the most terrible paradoxes of Riese. The more obvious it becomes that the entire giant complex can no longer be completed, the more fiercely work continues in selected directions. It is as though incompletion itself drives the convulsive effort. At least part must be finished. At least individual sectors must be made usable. Underground, what must remain is not chaos, but the beginning of some new supporting space. The enemy's reaction is almost impersonal, yet no less dangerous because of that. Bombing raids do not need to know the details of Project Riese in order to make underground strategy necessary. The Red Army does not need to see the complex's entire internal scheme in order to make its completion almost unattainable. The enemy does not need to solve the secret in order to destroy it. Sometimes it is enough simply to move faster than concrete can harden. From this point, an important shift appears in the logic of the investigation itself. Until now, the question sounded like this: what exactly did the Nazis want to build in the mountains of Lower Silesia? Now the question changes. What were they trying to save under conditions in which the outcome of the war was already clear? The difference between those two formulations is enormous. The first belongs to design, the second belongs to panic, which can distort any design beyond recognition. It is in this stage that Project Riese becomes especially difficult to understand historically. If priorities were changing on the move, if some sectors were accelerated while others were abandoned, if the project was being reshaped under the pressure of the front, then the final outline of the facility inevitably becomes blurred. What we see is not a completed system, but traces of several decisions layered over one another in a state of catastrophe. That helps explain why there are still so many arguments around Riese. The mystery survives not only because of secrecy, though the secrecy was indeed immense. It survives also because the late Reich was itself changing the project in the middle of its own collapse. What may have originally been conceived as one thing could, in the final stage of the war, have been used or prepared for quite differently. The underground city was not a static plan, but a changing construction of desperation. Kammler, in this phase, looks almost like the embodiment of the complex itself. He combines engineering rationality with the complete moral destruction of the system. His task is no longer to complete the construction elegantly. His task is to extract the maximum from it up to the very last possible minute. And that is what makes him the key figure of the turning point. Through him, Project Riese ceases to be merely secret. It becomes convulsive. From this threshold onward, the tunnels themselves are perceived differently. They no longer look like the future of a confident regime. They become traces of a descent downward, into stone, into a space where power hopes to shelter itself from the consequences of its own war. Every unfinished passage, every roughly reinforced section, every break between the scale of the design and the degree of readiness now reads as a sign not of strength, but of haste. That is why the final phase of Project Riese matters so much for understanding the Nazi system as a whole. A regime that only recently was rebuilding Europe in its own image is now trying to hide in the mountains the remnants of its military and political nervous system. This is no longer a gesture of expansion. It is a gesture of self-preservation, not a display of power, but an admission of vulnerability expressed not in words, but in vaults, shafts, and sealed approaches. But the more rapidly this turning point advances, the clearer another truth becomes. An underground world can conceal a facility, but it cannot stop history. One can accelerate the work. One can subject people to deadly labor. One can destroy traces and classify functions. But if the front approaches faster than the complex can be finished, then no depth provides real salvation any longer. That is exactly what turns Riese into a tragedy of the late Reich. The strategic significance of Project Riese becomes especially visible precisely in its incompletion. If it had been just one more defensive facility, it would have dissolved among the many wartime constructions of the late Reich. But Riese shows something greater. It captures the moment when the Third Reich stops thinking in terms of offensive momentum and begins thinking in terms of underground survival. This is no longer the language of victory. It is the language of a regime that understands that the surface no longer fully belongs to it. Factories are vulnerable. Transport is vulnerable. Headquarters are vulnerable. Even symbolic centers of power can no longer be considered untouchable. In such a reality, the underground complex in Silesia becomes not merely an engineering decision, but an expression of the new military psychology of the late Reich. That is why the consequences of Riese cannot be measured only by what was or was not completed. The very fact that such a project was launched shows how deeply Germany had altered its strategic logic by the end of the war. Not long before, the Reich sought to expand the space under its control. Now it cut space out inside the mountains as though trying to hide there the remnants of its stability, power, and productive capacity. From a military point of view, this is an important signal. Facilities like this do not appear in periods of confidence. They appear when command is searching for forms of rescue from a war that can no longer be held by ordinary means. Project Riese becomes exactly such a signal. The underground giant speaks of the weakness of the system no less than of its technical ambition, and perhaps even more so. But the consequences of the project are double-edged. On the one hand, it consumes immense forces, materials, transport, engineering attention, security, the organizational resources of the SS and the camp system, and the lives of prisoners are all drawn into a construction that was meant to become one of the most protected sites of the late Reich. Under conditions of German exhaustion, such a redistribution of effort was itself a decision of strategic scale. On the other hand, that price yields no obvious decisive result. By the time Germany collapses, Project Riese remains unfinished, and its final purpose never takes on a form so complete that it can be unambiguously fixed from the traces that survived. In that lies one of the main outcomes. The Reich invests enormous resources in an underground hope, yet never obtains a finished instrument of salvation. That is why Riese must be understood not as the failure of a single construction project, but as a symptom of a larger process. The late Third Reich responds more and more often to threats not with long-term stability, but with emergency secrecy, brutal acceleration, and the diversion of strength into last-chance projects. Project Riese becomes one of the clearest examples of that kind of thinking. For the leadership, projects like this had an almost irrational attraction. When the ordinary forms of control over the war begin to collapse, the idea of a closed space hidden from aviation and partly removed from the vulnerability of the front becomes especially tempting. An underground facility promises not only protection, it promises the illusion of control at the very moment when everything around it is already slipping out of control. It is in that sense that the reaction of the highest command to such projects can be understood as a mixture of desperation and fanatical belief. Desperation, because the very need to go down into the mountains already speaks of mounting collapse. Belief, because the regime continues investing in secret salvation, even when almost no time remains. To go on building to the end becomes a form of denial of impending defeat. Such an approach has another consequence as well. The more tightly the leadership clings to underground solutions, the more it detaches itself from the real proportion between the design and the possibility of completing it. In the case of Riese, this gap is especially visible. The scale of the project corresponds to an almost fantastic task. But Germany's position at the end of the war no longer corresponds to a task of that scale. From this comes the historical tragedy of the complex. For the war itself, Project Riese does not become a weapon of reversal. It does not change the balance of forces. It does not save the Reich from military collapse. But that does not make it insignificant. Its importance lies elsewhere. It shows what Germany's war machine becomes in its final phase. It no longer produces victory so much as it builds protected shells for delaying the inevitable. There is also a moral dimension to these consequences. Riese was impossible without the fusion of underground construction and the camp system. That means the late Nazi project of survival rested not only on concrete and secrecy, but on the forced labor of people reduced to the status of expendable material. The underground complex becomes not merely a symbol of the Reich's crisis, but a symbol of how that crisis was shifted onto the bodies of prisoners. That is why any investigation of Project Riese must not drift into convenient mysticism. The mystery of the complex is powerful, not because one can endlessly build fantastic theories around it. It is powerful because what stands before us is a real trace of a system that was simultaneously building, concealing, changing functions, fragmenting control, and destroying evidence. It is not miracle weapons that make this story terrifying, but the structure of late Nazi administration itself. That is especially important in understanding why the purpose of the complex remains unclear. The mystery does not necessarily survive because one grand secret is hidden deep in the mountains and was simply never found. Something else is more likely. By the end of the war, the Reich's apparatus was already acting in such a way that the project could shift functions, levels of priority, and zones of completion in the course of construction itself, leaving behind not one coherent design, but a disintegrating contour. From this follows the central conclusion of this act. Riese matters not because it can be proven to have hidden one specific supersolution, but because it expressed several desperate functions of the late Reich at once. protection, shelter, possible production, possible command, preservation of remaining control, destruction of traces. It is precisely the overlap of these functions that made the project so difficult to decipher conclusively. And the more closely we look at the consequences of Riese, the clearer it becomes that this is a monument not to power, but to fear. The enormous underground complex in the mountains of Lower Silesia did not become the foundation of a new phase of war. It became a stone imprint of the moment when the regime already felt the surface slipping away and tried to hide in the depth of the mountains at least some form of its own continuation. Even unfinished, it says that more loudly than many documents. After the war, the fate of Hans Kammler itself becomes a continuation of the underground mystery he served. While some leaders of the Reich end up in the dock and others end their lives in bunkers or on roads of flight, Kammler seems to dissolve at the border between document and legend. That disappearance is exactly what makes him the ideal final figure of this whole story. In May 1945, he vanishes from sight as though the very logic of Project Riese were descending into darkness with him. Contradictory versions, late testimonies, and guesses appear around his end almost immediately. For the investigation, this becomes an important echo. The man who directed a system of secret construction, camp labor, and underground war leaves behind no final ending that is beyond dispute. This is not an accidental detail and not a side plot. Kammler's disappearance reflects the very nature of Riese. We see tunnels, unfinished chambers, traces of concrete works, traces of camps, fragments of administrative logic. But where the final answer should stand, there is emptiness. The same thing happens with the figure of the project's overseer. The closer we come to the end of the story, the more strongly it dissolves into shadows. And yet there is a harsh clarity within that uncertainty. Even if Kammler's final hours remain disputed, his historical role does not disappear. He remains the man through whom Nazi engineering was joined to forced labor, to a regime of absolute secrecy, and to the attempt to hide in stone what could no longer be held on the surface. His disappearance does not erase what was done. It only deepens the darkness around it. At this point, it is especially easy to surrender to the temptation of sensation, to talk about gold, secret archives, vanished trains, hidden superweapons, and underground treasure. But the real power of the story of Riese lies elsewhere. It does not need invented sensationalism. What stands before us is already terrifying enough. In the final months of the war, the Nazi system pours enormous force into an underground complex built in blood and in panic. That is why Project Riese matters today, not as a legend about a miracle hidden beneath a mountain, but as a document of the final instincts of the Third Reich. When the regime loses the sky, loses space, loses time, and loses confidence, it does not abandon violence. On the contrary, it tries to deepen it, hide it, pour it into concrete, organize it into tunnels, and turn it into a new form of existence underground. Beneath the mountains of Lower Silesia, an unfinished monument to that logic still lies today. Not a monument to might, but a monument to fear. Not a monument to foresight, but to a desperate attempt to win from history the last meters and the last weeks. What is preserved in that rock is not the triumph of the Reich, but its panic. And that is precisely why Riese makes such a powerful impression even in its unfinished form. When we return to the central question of the whole story, the answer must sound both firm and cautious. Was Project Riese a new headquarters, an underground armaments center, or a hybrid city of last resort? We cannot honestly claim what surviving traces do not confirm, but we can see the most important thing. This was a real, enormous, and emergency project of the late Reich, born at the intersection of fear, secrecy, and violence. The mystery of Riese survives not because one fantastic answer is necessarily hidden deep in the mountains. It survives because the late Nazi apparatus itself was operating in a state of disintegration. It built while changing functions. It classified while accelerating. It tried to complete while destroying traces. It is exactly this mixture of haste, brutality, and closure that turned the project into a historical labyrinth from which there is still no single simple exit. In that sense, the incompletion of the complex says more than its full completion might have said. If Riese had been finished, it might have given us a clearer function. But it is precisely its torn and interrupted condition that allows us to see the inner state of the Reich itself in 1944 and 1945. What stands before us is not a completed system of power, but its underground imprint at the moment of disintegration, when even a gigantic design can no longer reach final form. That is why the story of Project Riese matters also as a warning. It shows how quickly engineering ceases to be neutral when it is subordinated to a regime of total control, slave labor, and the idea of salvation at any price. Tunnels, vaults, concrete chambers, and blasted passages do not carry evil in themselves. But in the hands of the Nazi system, they become instruments of concealment, exploitation, and the desperate prolongation of war at the cost of human lives. And perhaps that is the most honest ending to this story. We do not know everything. We cannot close the case with one dramatic revelation, but we know enough to call things by their proper names. Project Riese was not a myth and not a post-war invention. It was a gigantic, real, and unfinished trace of a dying Reich trying to hide its collapse beneath the thickness of a mountain.